My father built his entire life around one simple rule. In business, success comes from investing in the right people. For more than 30 years, Richard Bennett was one of the most respected venture capital figures in Boston. Founders chased his approval. Investors followed his decisions. Newspapers called him a man who could spot the next billion-dollar company before anyone else even noticed it. My father loved repeating the same sentence at every business dinner and every investor conference. Good investments change the world. But on my brother Andrew's birthday, my father stood in front of 200 guests and explained something else. He said the worst mistake an investor can make is putting money into the wrong person. The room laughed politely, assuming he was about to tell another story about a failed startup. Then he turned and looked directly at me. I was holding a single sheet of paper in my hand, a loan guarantee form for my graduate program in data science and artificial intelligence. I had only asked him to sign it. He didn't even look at the document. Instead, he reached into his jacket, pulled out a checkbook, and wrote a check for $1 million. The check was not for me. It was for my brother Andrew, to launch his startup. Everyone in the room applauded. I stood there quietly, while my father handed Andrew the check like he was presenting a trophy. That was the moment my father decided that investing in me would be his biggest mistake. That night, I walked out of the Bennett mansion with a small suitcase and no plan for what would happen next. Years later, my father would walk into a startup investment conference with more than 200 investors in the room, and he would freeze when he saw the name of the person sitting at the decision table, Clara Bennett, technology partner. The Bennett family name carried weight in Boston's business world. My father had spent decades building a reputation as one of the sharpest venture capital minds in the technology sector. When Richard Bennett invested in a company, people assumed it was only a matter of time before that company became successful. He loved the logic of venture capital. Find the right founder, give them resources, watch the return multiply. But the same philosophy he used in business shaped the way he looked at his children. To my father, people were investments. Some were promising opportunities, others were liabilities. My older brother Andrew was the investment he believed would build the Bennett legacy. Andrew had always been charismatic, confident, and comfortable in business conversations. Even when we were younger, my father took him to investor dinners and startup conferences. Andrew grew up learning how to talk like a founder long before he actually built anything. I was different. I loved mathematics and programming. I spent hours studying statistics, machine learning models, and predictive algorithms. While Andrew talked about building companies, I wanted to understand how data could explain patterns in financial markets and technology trends. By the time I finished college, I had become obsessed with one idea. Artificial intelligence could predict investment risk better than human intuition. That idea pushed me toward a graduate program in data science and AI at Northeastern University. The program was expensive, but I didn't ask my father for money. I only asked him to sign as a guarantor on the loan application. I believed that was reasonable. After all, parents supported their children's education all the time. I chose Andrew's birthday party to ask him because I knew he would already be in a good mood. The Bennett mansion was full that night. Business partners, venture capital investors, and family friends filled the dining hall. The event felt less like a birthday party and more like a networking reception for Boston's startup elite. A large banner hung near the stage, celebrating Andrew Bennett, the future of innovation. Conversations around the room revolved around Andrew's new company idea. Investors asked him questions about market potential and funding strategy. People spoke about him like he had already become the next great technology founder. No one asked about my plans. After dinner, my father stood up to give a toast. The room fell silent almost instantly. When Richard Bennett spoke, people listened. He raised a glass of champagne and began talking about investment philosophy. He explained how every successful venture capitalist must learn to recognize the difference between good opportunities and bad ones. In business, he said, the most expensive mistake you can make is investing in the wrong person. Guests nodded as if they were attending one of his famous investor lectures. Then he turned toward Andrew with a proud smile. My son Andrew is exactly the kind of founder every investor hopes to discover. Applause spread across the room. Andrew grinned while people clapped and congratulated him. Then my father looked at me. His expression changed slightly, the way it did when he was about to explain a difficult lesson. I stepped forward and placed the loan document on the table beside him. "Dad," I said quietly, "I just need your signature as guarantor." My father glanced at the paper for less than a second. Then he pushed it back toward me. "Clara," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "in business, you must learn when not to invest." The room grew awkwardly quiet. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his checkbook. "Because investing in the wrong person," he continued, writing quickly across the check, "is the biggest mistake any investor can make." When he finished writing, he handed the check to Andrew. $1 million. The room erupted in applause again. Andrew looked stunned and thrilled at the same time. My father placed a hand on his shoulder like he was announcing the launch of a new empire. I stood there holding the unsigned loan document while everyone celebrated Andrew's future. In that moment, something inside me shifted. It wasn't anger, it was clarity. My father had already decided which child was worth investing in. I quietly folded the document and placed it back into my bag. No one noticed when I stepped away from the table. Conversations resumed. Glasses clinked. Music started again in the background. I walked through the hallway of the mansion I had grown up in and opened the front door. Outside, the cool Boston night felt strangely peaceful. For the first time in my life, I left the Bennett house without asking permission and without knowing where I would go next. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would never ask my father to invest in me again. And someday, somewhere far away from that dining room, I would build something so powerful that he would have no choice but to see the mistake he made that night. Years later, when he walked into a technology investment summit hoping to save Andrew's company, he would discover that the person deciding the future of his investment was the daughter he once called his worst mistake. The first night after I left the Bennett mansion, I slept in a cheap hotel near Kendall Square with my suitcase on the chair beside the bed. I remember staring at the ceiling and realizing that for the first time in my life, there was no Bennett safety net under me. No family connections, no family money, no second chances if I failed. The strange thing was that I didn't feel afraid. I felt quiet, like the noise of my father's expectations had finally disappeared. Within a week, I found a small studio apartment in Cambridge, just a few blocks from the cluster of technology companies that surrounded the MIT campus. The apartment was barely large enough for a bed, a desk, and a tiny kitchen counter, but it was mine. During the day, I worked as a junior data assistant at a small fintech startup that analyzed payment systems for online businesses. My job was mostly cleaning messy datasets and organizing financial transaction records. It was tedious work that most people ignored. But I loved it. Data had a strange honesty to it. Numbers didn't care about reputation or confidence or family names. They only reflected reality. At night, I took freelance programming jobs and studied machine learning on my laptop. I spent hours teaching myself how predictive algorithms worked, how models learned patterns from historical data, and how artificial intelligence could detect signals that humans often missed. Slowly, something began forming in my mind. After several months working inside the fintech company, I started noticing patterns in the startup world around me. New companies were launching everywhere across Boston's tech scene. Founders presented bold ideas and promised revolutionary technology. Venture capital firms funded them quickly, often based on little more than excitement and confidence. But many of those companies failed within a few years. When I examined the financial and market data, the reasons for those failures often appeared long before the companies collapsed. Revenue projections were unrealistic. Customer growth was inflated. Operational costs were impossible to sustain. The warning signs were hiding in the numbers. The problem was that most investors never analyzed those numbers deeply enough. They relied on instinct and reputation. That realization pushed me toward an idea that slowly consumed my nights. What if artificial intelligence could analyze startup data and predict which companies were likely to fail before investors lost millions of dollars? I began building a simple experimental model on my computer. I collected publicly available information from startup databases, financial filings, and market reports. Then I started training a machine learning system to recognize patterns connected to success and failure. At first, the results were rough and inconsistent. But as I improved the model, something remarkable started happening. The system began identifying risks that matched real outcomes. One evening, while running a test using data from several Boston startups, my algorithm predicted that a rapidly growing delivery company would collapse within the next year. At the time, that company was being praised in business magazines as a future industry leader. 8 months later, the company shut down after running out of cash. That moment made my heart race. It meant the system was seeing something real. A few weeks later, I attended a small networking event for technology professionals at a co-working space downtown. The room was filled with startup founders trying to meet investors and analysts. I mostly stood near the back listening to conversations about funding rounds and product launches. At one point, a group of people began debating why so many startups fail despite strong investor backing. Without thinking too much, I mentioned that most failures could probably be predicted by analyzing the right data. A man standing nearby turned toward me. He looked older than most of the people in the room, with gray hair and the calm expression of someone who had spent decades observing the same conversations. His name was Daniel Harper. I recognized it immediately. Daniel was a veteran venture capitalist who had invested in several well-known technology companies over the years. He studied me with curiosity. "You think startup failure can be predicted?" he asked. I explained the model I had been developing and how it analyzed patterns in financial growth, team structure, and operational spending. Daniel listened carefully, asking sharp questions about the algorithm and the type of data it required. When I finished explaining, he leaned slightly closer and said something unexpected. "If your system works," he said, "it could change how venture capital works." I assumed he was being polite, but Daniel wasn't finished. A few days later, he invited me to meet him at his office. When I arrived, he placed several folders on the table. Inside were financial records and performance data from companies he had invested in over the past 20 years. Some of them had become extremely successful, others had failed dramatically. Daniel explained that the information was confidential, but he wanted to test something. "Run your model on these companies," he said. "Let's see what it finds." For the next several weeks, I worked on analyzing the data. I fed every dataset into the algorithm and adjusted the model repeatedly until the predictions stabilized. When I finally showed the results to Daniel, he sat quietly reviewing the screen. The system had correctly identified most of the successful companies years before their growth exploded. It had also flagged several failed investments long before they collapsed. Daniel leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath. "Clara," he said, "this might be the most useful tool an investor could ever have." I felt a strange mix of excitement and disbelief. My father had spent decades claiming that the secret to business success was knowing which people deserved investment. And here I was, building a machine that could analyze the truth behind those decisions. Daniel eventually proposed something I had never imagined. Instead of me continuing to work small technology jobs, he wanted to help build a company around the algorithm, a platform that could evaluate startup risk using artificial intelligence. At first, I hesitated. My entire life, I had been told that business decisions belonged to people like Andrew, not people like me. Daniel seemed to sense my uncertainty. "Your father invested in confidence," he said quietly, "but intelligence is the asset that actually creates value." Those words stayed with me. Over the next 2 years, Daniel and I built the platform together. The system analyzed startup technology claims, financial models, and operational data to determine whether a company had real potential or hidden risks. Venture capital firms began quietly using our system before committing money to new companies. And slowly, something interesting began happening across the Boston startup ecosystem. Several companies rejected by our platform failed shortly afterward. Investors started whispering about a mysterious algorithm that could detect bad startups before they collapsed. I rarely thought about my family during that time. Occasionally, I would see Andrew's name in business articles describing his startup as a promising new company in financial technology. But every time I read those articles, something about the descriptions felt strange. The company talked about powerful artificial intelligence systems, but never showed real technical details. It looked more like marketing than engineering. Still, I ignored it. My focus was on building something real. Then, one morning, nearly 3 years after I left home, an email arrived that changed everything again. A major technology corporation wanted to acquire our platform, and if the deal went through, the daughter my father once called his worst investment would suddenly become someone the entire venture capital world needed to listen to. When the email arrived, I assumed it was another request for a partnership meeting. Over the previous year, several venture firms had shown interest in the predictive platform Daniel and I built, but most of those conversations ended with cautious curiosity rather than serious offers. This message felt different. The sender was a senior acquisitions director from a large technology corporation headquartered in New York. The subject line was simple: strategic acquisition proposal. I forwarded the email to Daniel and walked down the hall to his office. He read the message once, then again more slowly. When he finally looked up at me, the expression on his face told me everything had just changed. "Clara," he said quietly, "this isn't a partnership request. The corporation wanted to buy the entire platform, not license the technology, not invest in the company, buy it completely." Over the next several weeks, our quiet little operation turned into something that looked more like a corporate battlefield. Lawyers, analysts, and technical auditors appeared in our office to examine every piece of the system I had built. They wanted proof that the algorithm was truly original and that no other company could replicate it easily. I spent hours explaining the architecture of the predictive models, the datasets used to train them, and the machine learning framework that allowed the system to identify patterns across thousands of startup records. The process was exhausting, but it also revealed something I hadn't fully realized before. The technology wasn't just useful, it was powerful. One executive from the acquiring company asked me a question during one of the evaluation meetings. "Do you understand what you've built?" he said. "You've created a system that can tell investors when not to trust a founder." Daniel watched me closely during those meetings. At one point, after a long negotiation session, he pulled me aside. "You're not just an engineer," he said. "You understand the economics behind this better than most venture capital analysts." That was when I started to realize the platform wasn't just a piece of technology. It was becoming something much larger. It was changing how investment decisions were made. 3 months after the negotiations began, the deal was finalized. The acquisition price was $120 million. I remember sitting in the conference room after the contracts were signed, staring at the final documents while the lawyers packed their briefcases. Only a few years earlier, I had been living in a tiny studio apartment trying to keep the lights on while writing code at midnight. Now, the algorithm I built during those late nights had become one of the most valuable analytical tools in the venture capital world. But Daniel had one more surprise waiting. A few days after the acquisition closed, he invited me to lunch at a quiet restaurant near the harbor. Halfway through the meal, he explained what he had been planning. "The platform is only the beginning," he said. "The real power comes from using it to evaluate companies before investors commit money." He offered me a position at his venture capital firm as technology partner. My job would be to sit on the investment committee and analyze the technology behind every startup that came through the firm. Instead of being the person asking for funding, I would help decide who deserved it. The idea was both thrilling and intimidating. For most of my life, I had been told that I wasn't built for business decisions. And now one of the most respected venture investors in the country wanted me helping shape them. I accepted the offer. Within months, I found myself sitting in conference rooms filled with founders presenting ambitious ideas and investors deciding where millions of dollars would go. What surprised me most was how often the confidence of founders hid the weakness of their technology. Many companies arrived with impressive presentations and bold promises, but very little real engineering behind them. My role quickly became clear. I wasn't there to judge personalities or charisma. I was there to evaluate truth. My models examined the structure of each startup's technology, the reliability of their data, the feasibility of their engineering plans, and the credibility of their development timelines. When the system identified serious weaknesses, we rejected the investment. When it recognized real potential, we moved forward. Over time, something interesting began happening across the venture community. Our firm's investments began outperforming many others. Several startups we funded became extremely successful. At the same time, companies we rejected often collapsed months later. Other venture firms started asking Daniel the same question. How are you finding these companies before anyone else? Daniel always gave a vague answer. We focus on fundamentals. But inside the firm, everyone knew the real reason. The algorithm had become our gatekeeper. Meanwhile, the Bennett name occasionally appeared in business news again. Andrew's company, Bennett Dynamics, was mentioned in articles describing him as an emerging entrepreneur in financial technology. Photographs showed him speaking at startup networking events and appearing on small investor panels. At first glance, the coverage looked impressive, but whenever I read those articles carefully, something bothered me. The company claimed to be building advanced artificial intelligence for financial predictions, yet the descriptions never included real technical details. No research papers, no engineering breakthroughs, no explanation of how the system actually worked. It was all language about disruption and innovation, but none of the signals that usually accompanied real technology companies. One afternoon, I decided to run a quick background analysis on Bennett Dynamics using our internal evaluation tools. The data was limited because the company had never raised significant venture capital funding, but the information that did exist revealed something interesting. Nearly all of the funding listed for the company came from a single source: Richard Bennett. My father had personally financed most of Andrew's startup. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen. The realization wasn't surprising, but it explained a lot. Without outside investors demanding real results, Andrew's company could survive for years on family money alone. I closed the report and returned to my work. My life had moved far beyond the night I left the Bennett mansion. My father's approval no longer defined my future. Then one morning, Daniel called me into his office with an announcement. Our firm was planning to host the largest startup investment summit in Boston that year. Hundreds of founders would present their companies to investors from across the country. It would be one of the most important events in the technology investment calendar. Daniel wanted me on the main evaluation panel. My algorithm would analyze the startups before they pitched, and I would question their technology during the presentations. I agreed immediately. A few days later, Daniel handed me the preliminary list of companies scheduled to present. I scanned through dozens of unfamiliar startup names until one of them made me stop reading. Bennett Dynamics. Andrew Bennett, founder and CEO. For the first time in years, I felt the past step quietly back into my life. My brother had just signed up to pitch his company to the very investors who now relied on my judgment to decide which startups were real. Andrew always knew how to look successful. Even when we were kids, he had a talent for walking into a room and convincing people that he already belonged there. Confidence came easily to him. It was the one quality my father valued more than anything else. Years after I left home, that confidence had become the public face of Bennett Dynamics. Articles in Boston's startup magazines described Andrew as a bold new founder building revolutionary artificial intelligence technology for financial markets. Photographs showed him standing in modern office spaces, smiling beside sleek presentation screens filled with graphs and futuristic slogans. If someone only looked at those articles, they would assume Andrew was running one of the most exciting new companies in the city. But I had spent years studying how real technology companies actually developed their products, and something about Bennett Dynamics didn't fit the pattern. Real innovation leaves a trail behind it. Engineers publish research, development teams grow, patent filings appear. Early product prototypes are tested and improved. Yet, every article about Andrew's company sounded strangely empty once you looked past the headlines. The language was full of phrases like predictive intelligence and financial disruption, but there were almost no details about the technology itself. Curious, I opened several startup databases and began reviewing the company's public records. What I found was even more unusual. Most early-stage startups raise money from multiple venture capital firms during their first years. Bennett Dynamics had raised almost nothing from outside investors. Instead, the funding history pointed repeatedly to a single source: Richard Bennett. My father had personally financed the company through multiple private investments. The first entry was the $1 million check he had given Andrew the night I left home. After that came several additional capital injections over the following years. Some of them were labeled as personal loans. Others appeared as direct equity investments. When I added the numbers together, the total amount of money Richard had poured into Andrew's company was staggering. Millions of dollars. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen, realizing what it meant. Bennett Dynamics wasn't surviving because the market believed in it. It was surviving because my father refused to let it fail. Over the next few days, I quietly asked a few contacts in Daniel's venture network if they knew anyone who had worked at Bennett Dynamics. Venture capital circles are small, and information travels quickly between engineers and investors. Within a week, I heard back from 2 former employees who had left the company earlier that year. Their descriptions of the company were almost identical. The office environment revolved around presentations, investor meetings, and marketing campaigns. But the engineering department was tiny and constantly changing. Developers came and went, often leaving after only a few months. One former software engineer told me something that stayed with me long after the conversation ended. "We spent more time building pitch decks than actual code," he said. According to him, Andrew often spoke confidently about complex artificial intelligence systems in investor presentations, but inside the company, those systems barely existed. The team had experimented with small data models, but nothing close to the powerful predictive platform Andrew described publicly. In other words, the technology behind Bennett Dynamics was mostly theoretical. The company was built on promises rather than products. That realization should have surprised me, but it didn't. I had seen similar patterns before while evaluating startups through Daniel's firm. Some founders built real companies. Others built narratives designed to attract investment before the technology was ready. The difference was that most investors eventually demanded proof. My father never had. A few weeks later, another piece of information reached me through the same network of contacts. Richard Bennett had recently mortgaged the Bennett mansion. The property had always been one of the most visible symbols of my father's success in Boston's business world. Hearing that it was now tied to a loan surprised even me. But when I looked deeper into the company's financial records, the reason became clear. Bennett Dynamics was running out of money. Without outside investors, the company depended entirely on my father's funding to keep operating. I imagined the conversations happening inside that mansion. Andrew promising that success was just around the corner. My father convincing himself that one more investment would finally prove he had chosen the right son to carry the Bennett legacy. Meanwhile, the company continued announcing ambitious plans to the public. Andrew's interviews grew more confident. Press releases promised that Bennett Dynamics would soon reveal a groundbreaking artificial intelligence platform capable of predicting financial market behavior with unprecedented accuracy. It was the kind of claim that attracted enormous investor interest, if it were true. Eventually, Andrew made an announcement that caught the attention of the entire Boston startup ecosystem. Bennett Dynamics would present its technology at the upcoming Boston Technology Investment Summit. The summit was the largest venture capital conference in the region that year. Hundreds of startup founders would pitch their companies to investors from across the country. For Andrew, it was the perfect stage. If he impressed the right venture firms, Bennett Dynamics could finally raise the funding it needed to survive without my father's money. What Andrew didn't know was that the summit was being hosted by Daniel Harper's firm, and Daniel had already placed me on the main technology evaluation panel. A few days later, the official pitch deck for Bennett Dynamics arrived in our evaluation system. Every startup scheduled to present at the conference submitted materials weeks in advance so the investment committee could review them. I opened the file late one evening after most of the office had gone home. The presentation was polished and confident, exactly the way Andrew had always presented himself. Slide after slide described an advanced artificial intelligence system designed to analyze financial data and predict market behavior for investors. The diagrams looked impressive. The language sounded technical. But the deeper I studied the slides, the more uneasy I felt. Certain phrases describing the architecture of the system sounded strangely familiar. The explanation of the predictive model resembled ideas I had written about years earlier while developing my own research on startup risk analysis. At first, I assumed it was coincidence. After all, similar ideas often appear across different research teams. But something about the structure of the system kept pulling my attention back to the screen. Finally, I decided to do something simple. I uploaded the Bennett Dynamics pitch deck into the evaluation platform my team used to analyze startup technology claims. The algorithm began scanning the presentation data and comparing it to thousands of known technical frameworks and development patterns. A few seconds later, the system generated its evaluation result. High risk, technology, credibility, failure. I stared at the message for a long moment. My brother was about to walk onto a stage filled with investors and present a company that my own system had already identified as fundamentally flawed. And in just a few weeks, Andrew Bennett would be standing in front of me trying to convince the world that Bennett Dynamics was real. The Boston Technology Investment Summit began early on a cold Monday morning, and by the time I arrived at the conference center, the building was already alive with the restless energy of entrepreneurs and investors chasing opportunity. The main hall was enormous, filled with rows of seats facing a wide stage where founders would present their companies one after another throughout the day. Venture capital firms, corporate innovation teams, angel investors, and technology analysts filled the audience. More than 200 startups had been selected to pitch at the summit, each hoping to secure the kind of funding that could transform an idea into a real company. I walked past clusters of founders rehearsing their presentations in the hallways and stepped into the main auditorium where the investment panel sat at a long table facing the stage. My nameplate was already waiting for me. Clara Bennett, Technology Partner, Harper Ventures. Daniel sat 2 seats away, reviewing the day's schedule while the other panel members discussed the evaluation process. For most of the founders in the room, this stage represented the most important moment of their careers. For me, it was simply another day doing the job I had been hired to do, analyze the technology behind the promises. The first few presentations began shortly after 9 in the morning. One by one, founders stepped onto the stage to describe their companies, each claiming to have discovered the next breakthrough in artificial intelligence, healthcare, or financial technology. Some presentations were impressive. Others fell apart quickly under scrutiny. When the moderator opened the floor for questions, I focused on the same details I always examined: how the technology worked, how the data was collected, and whether the founders actually understood the systems they were presenting. One founder described a machine learning model designed to optimize logistics networks. When I asked about the dataset used to train the model, he hesitated and admitted the company was still collecting the necessary information. The panel declined to continue the funding discussion. Another startup presented an AI tool for medical diagnostics, but their lead engineer answered every question with clear technical explanations and real validation data. That company advanced to the next round of investor meetings. As the morning continued, the room gradually began to understand the role I played on the panel. Investors leaned forward when I started asking questions. Founders became noticeably more careful with their answers. Daniel later joked that my job was to separate real innovation from storytelling. Around midday, the moderator announced the next company scheduled to present. "Up next," he said, glancing down at his notes. "Bennett Dynamics." For a brief moment, the words seemed to echo across the hall. I kept my expression neutral and glanced toward the side entrance of the stage. Andrew walked in with the confident stride I remembered from years earlier. He wore a tailored navy suit and carried himself with the easy charisma that had always impressed people who met him for the first time. The audience greeted him with polite applause as he approached the podium. At first, Andrew scanned the investor panel casually, the way most founders did when gauging the room. Then, his eyes stopped. His gaze locked on the nameplate sitting in front of me. Clara Bennett. I watched the recognition hit him like a sudden shock. For a fraction of a second, his expression froze, as if his mind was trying to understand how I had ended up sitting on the panel that would judge his company. He recovered quickly and forced a confident smile, but I could see the tension behind it. Andrew had not expected to see me here. My attention shifted briefly toward the audience. In the second row, seated among several investors and corporate representatives, was Richard Bennett. My father looked exactly the same as he had the night I left home. Sharp suit, calm posture, the quiet authority of someone accustomed to controlling a room. He was watching Andrew with a proud expression, completely unaware of what his son had just discovered. To him, this was the moment Andrew's company would finally prove itself to the venture capital world. Andrew began his presentation smoothly. The opening slides introduced Bennett Dynamics as a cutting-edge financial technology company developing advanced artificial intelligence capable of predicting market behavior. The concept was ambitious and attractive to investors. Financial prediction systems had always been one of the most valuable goals in the technology sector. If someone could truly build such a system, the potential profits would be enormous. Andrew spoke confidently about predictive algorithms, data modeling systems, and machine learning architectures designed to analyze global financial patterns. The slides looked polished and professional. The audience listened with growing interest. But as I studied the presentation more carefully, the same problem I had noticed while reviewing the pitch deck returned immediately. The technical explanations were vague. The slides contained impressive diagrams and terminology, but they never explained how the system actually worked. Real engineers always described the architecture behind their technology. Andrew described only the results he claimed the system would achieve. When he finished speaking, the moderator thanked him and opened the floor to questions from the investment committee. I pressed the microphone button in front of me. "Mr. Bennett," I said calmly, "can you explain which dataset was used to train your predictive AI model?" Andrew paused for a moment before answering. "Our system analyzes large-scale financial data from multiple market sources," he said. The answer sounded confident but empty. I asked the next question. "What machine learning architecture does the model use to process that data?" Andrew mentioned neural networks and deep learning frameworks, but the explanation lacked any real technical structure. Several investors began taking notes. I continued asking questions about data validation, model accuracy testing, and system deployment. With each answer, Andrew became slightly less confident. He repeated phrases from the presentation slides without explaining the underlying engineering. The room grew noticeably quieter as investors realized the technology might not exist in the way it had been described. Andrew attempted to redirect the conversation toward the company's long-term vision, but the momentum of the pitch had already shifted. One investor in the front row quietly closed his evaluation folder. Another leaned toward his colleague and whispered something while pointing at the slide describing the algorithm. I glanced again toward the audience and saw my father's expression slowly changing. At first, he looked confused by the direction of the questions. Then he began to understand what was happening. Andrew was struggling to explain the technology behind his own company. After another hesitant answer from Andrew, my father suddenly stood up from his seat. His voice carried across the hall before anyone could stop him. "Clara," he said loudly, "you know exactly how this technology works." Every head in the room turned toward the panel. Andrew looked stunned. The moderator looked confused, and my father continued speaking with the confidence that had always made people listen to him. "After all," he said, gesturing toward the stage, "our family built this company together." For the first time since the summit began, the focus of the entire room shifted away from Andrew and directly onto me. 200 investors were now waiting to hear what I would say next. The room went silent after my father spoke. It was the kind of silence that doesn't happen often in rooms filled with investors and founders, a silence heavy with curiosity and tension. 200 people had just heard Richard Bennett publicly claim that I was involved in building the technology behind Andrew's company. Every eye in the hall moved between the stage and the investor panel, waiting for my reaction. Andrew stood frozen beside the presentation screen, his confident posture gone. My father remained standing in the audience, as if he had just delivered the final argument in a negotiation. For a moment, I simply watched the room. The moderator looked uncertain, unsure whether to interrupt. Daniel was studying me carefully from 2 seats away. I realized exactly what my father was trying to do. If I confirmed his statement, the credibility of Bennett Dynamics would instantly recover. Investors would assume the technology had real substance because I was associated with it. The entire situation could be saved with a single sentence. Instead, I turned back toward Andrew as if my father had not spoken at all. "Mr. Bennett," I said calmly into the microphone, "let's continue with the technical evaluation." A few investors shifted in their seats, surprised that I had ignored the interruption. Andrew swallowed and nodded nervously. I kept my voice steady. "Earlier you mentioned your system processes large-scale financial market data. Can you explain how your model handles real-time data streams?" Andrew hesitated before answering. "Our platform integrates multiple data feeds to produce predictive insights," he said. The sentence sounded polished but empty, the kind of language often used in startup presentations when the technology itself is still vague. I asked the next question. "What machine learning architecture supports those predictions?" Andrew repeated the same terms he had used earlier: neural networks, predictive analytics, advanced modeling. But he never described how the system was actually built. The investors on the panel began exchanging quick glances. One of them leaned closer to his microphone, but then decided not to interrupt yet. I continued. "How was the model trained?" Andrew shifted his weight slightly. "We used extensive financial datasets to train the system over time." "Which datasets?" I asked. Andrew paused again. "Various proprietary sources." That answer finally triggered quiet whispers across the room. Anyone familiar with machine learning knew that training data was one of the most important components of an AI system. Founders usually described their datasets proudly because they represented the foundation of their technology. Andrew's inability to explain the source suggested something troubling. I moved to the next question. "How do you validate the model's prediction accuracy?" Andrew glanced briefly toward my father in the audience before answering. "We're still refining the validation process," he said. The room shifted again. Several investors began typing notes into their tablets. Daniel leaned back in his chair, watching Andrew carefully. At this point, the pattern had become obvious. Andrew could repeat the language of artificial intelligence, but he could not explain how his company's system actually worked. I decided to ask the question that often separated real technology from startup storytelling. "Andrew," I said quietly, "can you show the panel the proprietary dataset used to train your model?" Andrew blinked. "The dataset is still being developed," he said. I nodded slightly. "So the predictive system you described earlier has not yet been trained?" Andrew looked uncertain. "We have early prototypes," he said, "but the final system is still in progress." A ripple of reaction spread through the audience. Investors who had been leaning forward with interest now sat back in their chairs. The situation had shifted dramatically. The company that had just claimed to possess revolutionary financial prediction technology was now admitting the core system did not exist yet. Before the moderator could speak, my father stood up again. His voice carried across the hall, louder this time. "This is unnecessary," he said firmly. The moderator looked startled, but my father continued anyway. "Clara has spent years studying this type of technology," he said. "She understands the potential of Andrew's work better than anyone in this room." His implication was obvious. He wanted me to validate the company publicly. If I simply said that the concept had promise, the investors might overlook the missing details and continue considering the deal. The entire room turned toward me again. For a brief moment, I felt the weight of every person watching. Andrew stood on the stage, tense and uncertain. My father looked confident that I would protect the family name, but my responsibility on that panel had nothing to do with family. It was about truth. I turned back to Andrew. "One more question," I said. "Does Bennett Dynamics currently hold any patents related to the predictive algorithm you described?" Andrew hesitated again. "The patent process is underway," he replied. That answer wasn't unusual for an early-stage startup, but something about the slide behind him kept drawing my attention. The diagram describing the algorithm architecture looked strangely familiar. The flow of data through the system resembled a design I had studied many times before. I opened the digital copy of the pitch deck on my tablet and zoomed in on the diagram. The architecture displayed several layers connected by a specific modeling shortcut I recognized instantly. My heart slowed as the realization formed. That structure had appeared in one of my earliest prototypes years ago, while I was building the predictive platform Daniel eventually helped commercialize. I studied the slide again carefully. The similarity was too precise to be coincidence. I looked up at Andrew standing under the conference lights, and then back at the diagram on my screen. Around me, the investors were still whispering quietly, while the moderator waited for the next step in the evaluation process. But I had already stopped listening to the conversation in the room, because something far more troubling than a weak startup pitch had just become clear. The algorithm Andrew was presenting to investors looked almost exactly like an early version of the system I had created years before, and that meant Bennett Dynamics might not just be exaggerating its technology, it might be using something that was never theirs to begin with. I kept staring at the slide behind Andrew while the room waited for the discussion to continue. The diagram showing the architecture of Bennett Dynamics' predictive engine looked almost identical to something I had built years earlier. Not just similar in concept, but similar in structure. The flow of data moved through the same sequence of modeling layers I had once experimented with when designing my first predictive system. At first, I told myself that two engineers could easily arrive at the same idea independently. Artificial intelligence research often produced parallel discoveries, but as I zoomed in on the diagram on my tablet, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. One of the modeling shortcuts in the system was extremely unusual. It was a workaround I had created during an early prototype phase when I didn't yet have enough training data to stabilize the model. Later versions of my platform replaced it with a more efficient structure. That shortcut had never appeared in my published work. It had only existed inside the early development files I kept privately while building the first version of the algorithm. Seeing it on Andrew's slide was like seeing a fingerprint. I slowly lifted my eyes from the tablet and looked toward the stage. Andrew stood there under the bright lights, waiting for the evaluation panel to continue the discussion. Around him, the audience remained quiet, still processing the earlier admission that his company's technology was incomplete. Daniel leaned slightly toward me and spoke quietly. "Something wrong?" he asked. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I pressed the microphone button again. "Mr. Bennett," I said calmly, "I have a few additional questions about the architecture shown in your presentation." Andrew nodded nervously. "Of course." I turned slightly, so the large screen behind him remained visible to the entire room. "This diagram shows the structure of your predictive algorithm. Can you confirm that Bennett Dynamics owns the intellectual property for this system?" Andrew answered quickly. "Yes," he said. "Our engineering team developed the entire platform internally. Several investors wrote that statement down." I asked the next question. "When was the system originally developed?" Andrew paused briefly before responding. "Our team began building the technology several years ago as part of the company's core research." His timeline immediately raised a problem in my mind. According to the financial records I had reviewed earlier, Bennett Dynamics had not employed a full engineering team during that period. In fact, most of the company's spending had gone toward marketing and investor presentations. I kept my voice steady. "Has the technology been patented?" Andrew hesitated again. The patent application is currently in progress, he said. That answer triggered movement across the investor section of the hall. Several venture analysts began opening patent databases on their laptops. I waited a moment before speaking again. "I would like to show the panel something," I said. The moderator nodded, giving me permission to connect my tablet to the presentation screen. Within seconds, a new document appeared behind Andrew. It was an official patent record from the United States Patent Database. The title described a predictive artificial intelligence system designed to analyze financial data and forecast market behavior. At the bottom of the document, the inventor's name was clearly visible: Clara Bennett. The filing date was several years earlier than the timeline Andrew had just described. The hall fell completely silent. Andrew turned slowly to read the screen behind him. My father leaned forward in his seat in the audience, trying to understand what the document meant. I spoke into the microphone again, still keeping my tone calm and professional. "This patent describes an artificial intelligence architecture designed to analyze financial markets using predictive modeling." I paused briefly. The structure of the system shown in Bennett Dynamics' presentation appears extremely similar to the architecture described in this patent. A wave of whispers spread through the audience. I continued carefully. If Bennett Dynamics is using this technology, the company would require a licensing agreement with the patent holder. The implication hung in the air for several seconds before anyone spoke. Andrew looked from the patent document back toward the investor panel, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and disbelief. My father's confident posture in the audience had disappeared. He now looked unsettled, like a man watching a carefully built narrative collapse in real time. One of the venture partners on the panel leaned toward his microphone. "Mr. Bennett," he said, addressing Andrew directly, "can you confirm whether your company has obtained licensing rights to this technology?" Andrew opened his mouth, but didn't answer immediately. The hesitation itself said more than any explanation. Around the room, investors began speaking quietly to one another. Some reopened the evaluation files they had closed earlier, but not out of renewed interest. They were reviewing the presentation with a new concern. The problem was no longer simply that Bennett Dynamics lacked a working product. Now there was a possibility that the technology it claimed to use belonged to someone else. Daniel remained silent beside me, watching the reaction across the hall. He understood what the investors were thinking. Venture capital firms avoided legal uncertainty at all costs. Even the possibility of intellectual property conflicts could destroy a funding deal instantly. I turned off the patent display and returned the presentation screen to Andrew's pitch deck. "Based on the information available," I said, addressing the panel, "the technical claims made by Bennett Dynamics require further verification before any investment discussion can proceed." It was the most neutral way to describe what had just happened. But the effect was immediate. One venture partner quietly closed his laptop. Another leaned toward the moderator and informed him that his firm was withdrawing interest in the pitch. The shift in the room was unmistakable. Only minutes earlier, Andrew had been presenting his company as the future of financial technology. Now, investors were treating the company as a potential liability. I glanced once more toward the audience. My father had slowly lowered himself back into his seat. For the first time in my life, I saw uncertainty in his eyes. Andrew stood alone on the stage, the confident founder from earlier replaced by someone who suddenly looked very small under the conference lights. The moderator cleared his throat and addressed the panel. "Ms. Bennett," he said carefully, "given this information, what is your recommendation regarding this investment opportunity?" Every investor in the room turned toward me again, and in that moment, the future of Andrew's company rested entirely on the decision of the daughter my father once refused to invest in. Every person in the room was watching me when the moderator asked for my recommendation. 200 investors sat in rows across the conference hall. Venture capital partners, analysts, startup founders, and corporate executives all waited quietly for the same thing, the final decision that would determine whether Bennett Dynamics would receive funding. On the stage, Andrew stood beside the presentation screen, his confidence gone, his posture rigid. In the audience, my father sat motionless, staring at the floor as if the room had suddenly become unfamiliar to him. I took a slow breath and spoke into the microphone. "The role of this panel," I said calmly, "is to evaluate whether a company is ready for investment." My voice carried clearly across the hall. "In this case, two issues prevent us from moving forward." I glanced briefly toward Andrew before continuing. "First, the company has not demonstrated a functioning AI system capable of delivering the predictive results described in the presentation." Several investors nodded quietly. "Second," I continued, "the architecture presented appears closely related to patented technology already owned by another party." I paused for a moment. "For those reasons, I cannot recommend investment in Bennett Dynamics at this time." The decision took less than 10 seconds to say out loud, but the impact was immediate. One venture partner closed his folder and pushed it aside. Another investor leaned toward the moderator and quietly withdrew his firm from the evaluation process. Within moments, the energy in the room shifted completely. Venture capital investing often moves like a current. Once confidence disappears, momentum vanishes with it. The moderator thanked Andrew for his presentation and signaled for the next company to prepare backstage. Andrew remained standing on the stage for several seconds longer than expected, still holding the remote control for the slides. The audience had already turned its attention toward the next startup preparing to present. I glanced toward him briefly before lowering my eyes to the evaluation notes in front of me. The pitch session had ended. Bennett Dynamics had lost its final chance to attract serious investment. As the next founder began setting up his presentation, I looked toward the audience again. My father was still sitting in his chair, but something about him had changed. For as long as I could remember, Richard Bennett had been the man who evaluated everyone else. Investors sought his approval. Founders tried to impress him. Now he had just watched his own investment collapse in front of the same community that once respected his judgment. A few minutes later, he quietly stood up and left the conference hall without saying a word. The rest of the summit continued, as if nothing unusual had happened. Founders presented new ideas, investors debated funding strategies, and the business world moved forward the way it always does. But I could feel the weight of what had just occurred settling slowly in the background. That evening, after the conference ended, I walked out of the building through a side entrance and into the cool Boston air. The streets were quiet compared to the crowded halls inside the summit. As I reached the parking area, I heard someone say my name behind me. "Clara." I turned around and saw my father standing a few steps away. For a moment, neither of us spoke. It had been years since we last stood face to face. He looked older than I remembered, the sharp confidence in his expression replaced by something more uncertain. "I didn't expect to see you on that panel," he finally said. His voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. "I imagine you didn't," I replied. He nodded slowly, looking toward the ground before speaking again. "Andrew's company. It never became what I hoped it would." The words sounded heavy, like they had taken years for him to say out loud. I kept believing that if I supported him long enough, he would prove everyone wrong. I listened without interrupting. My father had spent decades teaching other investors how to judge risk, but when it came to his own family, he had ignored the same rules. "The company is running out of money," he continued. "If it collapses now, everything I invested in it disappears." He looked up at me carefully. "You could help fix that." I already knew what he meant. If my firm licensed the technology from my patent to Bennett Dynamics, Andrew's company might still convince investors that it had real potential. It would give the company a chance to survive. "We're family," my father added quietly. For a moment, I said nothing. I thought about the night I left the Bennett mansion holding an unsigned loan document while my father handed Andrew a $1 million check. I thought about the years that followed, when I built my career without anyone believing in me except the people who chose to see my work. Finally, I answered him. Family isn't just the people who share your last name, I said. Family is the people who believe in you before success makes it obvious. My father didn't respond. He understood the meaning behind the words. I wished him well, then walked toward my car without looking back. In the months that followed, Bennett Dynamics quietly shut down after failing to raise new funding. Andrew disappeared from the startup headlines that had once praised him. My father gradually withdrew from the venture capital community where he had built his reputation. Meanwhile, my work at Daniel's firm continued expanding. Investors trusted my judgment because it was based on evidence rather than confidence. A few years later, I created something that mattered far more to me than any startup investment. The Bennett Fellowship Program funds students from disadvantaged backgrounds who want to study artificial intelligence, data science, and software engineering. Every year, it helps people who were once told they weren't capable of succeeding in technology. Looking back now, I realize my father was right about one thing. The most expensive mistake an investor can make is choosing the wrong person. But the real tragedy isn't investing in the wrong person. It's failing to recognize the right one when they're standing in front of you. And if you've ever had someone tell you that you weren't worth the investment, remember something important. The people who doubt you are not always the best judges of your potential. Sometimes the greatest success comes from walking away and building your own path. If this story connected with you, I'd love to know where you're watching from and whether anyone in your life ever underestimated you. Your stories matter too. And if you enjoy real-life style stories about resilience, hidden strength, and moments when the truth finally turns the tables, consider staying with the channel and subscribing so you don't miss the next story.